for the invitation. My goodness, to be invited back a second time. What an honor that is. It's humbling. When Chris called me about a month and a half or so ago to ask me if I'd share one of my stories with your fine organization, Chris is quite the gentleman, ever tactful. Chris said, well, Clark, you remember 4 years ago, the story that you shared with us, it was about George Washington. Great man, no question about it, but that's 2.5 centuries ago. This Rotary Club, we're cutting edge. Cutting edge, kind of, Chris, I get it. You want somebody more modern to be the subject of my story, more up to date. Chris, yes, that's it. Abraham Lincoln. Chris said, well, okay, I guess he allowed me to share my story that I had been given some thought to. The title of my story, The Greatest Speech in U.S. History, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Gary Wills tells us that the Gettysburg Address, the words that remade America. Other historians describe the Gettysburg Address as marking the second founding of the great United States. While other historians, scholars describe it more simply, maybe more profoundly, the greatest speech in U.S. history. Perhaps many of us, going back to our junior high school days, we had an English teacher or a high school teacher that assigned the Gettysburg Address as required reading, maybe even required us to memorize it, maybe even present it to the class. Well, I can't speak for you all, but when we did, I questioned whether we really understood it. I even questioned whether our English teacher, our history teacher, really understood it. And the purpose of my story today is to help us understand why the Gettysburg Address may well be the greatest speech in our nation's history. It may well mark the second founding of the United States. It may well be the words that remade America. Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address on November 19th, 1863, 2.5 years into the great uncivil war, the bloodiest, costliest war in all of Western civilization up to the time. What Lincoln does in his opening sentence, he takes his audience back in time and makes a statement that was startling at the time. Abraham Lincoln tells us that our nation was founded on two principles: liberty and equality. Liberty and equality. No one, certainly no one in a high leadership position, no president, had ever used the words liberty and equality as our nation's founding principles. And that's what the Gettysburg Address is all about. Before the Gettysburg Address, scholars, historians, our leadership class, they didn't talk in terms of equality. What's that mean? They talked about liberty in the sense of, I'm free to do what I want to do. I don't want to be subjugated to King George III of England. But they didn't talk about liberty in the sense that we think of it today. Abraham Lincoln brought the words equality and liberty. And as Gary Wills, the historian I mentioned moments ago, says that as a result of the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln imbued equality into the spirit of the United States. And ever since, to one degree or another, our leadership class has acknowledged that equality and equality and liberty are founding principles of this nation. Before Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, no. That's the essence of the Gettysburg Address: liberty and equality. Lincoln was a lawyer. He was a great lawyer. Bernard Schwartz, renowned professor at New York Law University, back half of the 20th century, he wrote a book in which Professor Schwartz tells us that Abraham Lincoln is one of our nation's 5 greatest lawyers. We're not talking about presidencies. One of our nation's 5 greatest lawyers. And what does a good lawyer, what does a great lawyer do when making a proposition that's bold, maybe that will not be well received? Abraham Lincoln says that our nation is founded in liberty and equality. The lawyer in Lincoln knows he's got to submit evidence. He's got to submit proof that our nation was founded on liberty and equality. Nobody had ever heard that before. What was Lincoln's proof? What was his evidence that these are our founding principles? In Abraham Lincoln's opening sentence, he takes us back in time 87 years. He delivers the address in 1863. He goes back in time 87 years. He doesn't use the word 87. He's drawing language from the book of Psalms in the Bible fourscore and 7 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In that one sentence, he espouses this new concept that our founding principles are liberty and equality, and he proves it. He proves it by saying fourscore and 7 years ago, he's taking us back to the year 1776. What happened in that pivotal year in our nation's history? Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. But again, what's unique about reference to the Declaration of Independence until the Gettysburg Address, when people thought of the Declaration of Independence, that was how we declared our independence from England. And the body of the Declaration has a list of 35 grievances that we have against King George III, justifying our separation from England. That's what historians, scholars, and the people talked about when contemplating Jefferson's magnum opus. But that isn't what Lincoln was referring to. He was referring to what until that time had gone unnoticed: the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, which since the Gettysburg Address have become perhaps the most memorable, the most memorized, the most heart-filling, soul-seeking words of all our founding documents. Jefferson said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Nobody had paid any attention for 87 years to that preamble. And now that's what we all think of when we think of the Declaration of Independence. Let's take Jefferson's sentence and parse that. We hold these truths to be self-evident. If it's truth, if it's self-evident, there's no debate. There's no need for elaboration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Jefferson isn't saying that we all have equal mental and physical abilities. Jefferson is saying We are created equal. We are in God's eyes all equal. What was Jefferson thinking about, though, in 1776? We Americans are equal to the British. We Americans are even equal to King George III. What was Lincoln thinking when he used the word equality in the first line of the Gettysburg Address? He was thinking we are all created by God, and thus, regardless of our race, we are all equal. Back to the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Jefferson is telling us we all have certain rights that are endowed to us by our Creator, by God. And if they are gifts from God, no man can take away certain rights. What rights? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, liberty. Jefferson, of course, was thinking that no man can take away our right to liberty. He was saying King George has no right to take liberty away from us because liberty is a gift from God. What was Lincoln thinking about as he incorporated Jefferson's preamble as justification, as proof that liberty and equality are our founding principles? Lincoln was thinking liberty in the sense of what? No slave master has control over any of us. In 1776, the population of the 13 newly created states, we were colonies. Then when those 56 men pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, we became the 13 states. The population of the 13 states was 2.5 million, 500,000 of whom were in shackles. They were chained to the land. For them, there was. For 20% of the population, there was no sense of equality, no sense of liberty. Moving forward, 87 years to the Gettysburg Address, the population of the then 35 states, 31.5 million. 7 million were still subject to the whim of the slave master. That's 12% of the population in 1863. By then, the demographics of slavery had been dramatically altered. You had your 20 free states, as they were called, for the most part, the northern states, and you had 15 states that were referred to as the slave states, where slavery was legal. The population of South Carolina and Mississippi, two of the 15 slave states, more than 50% of the populations of South Carolina and Mississippi enslaved. For those still enslaved, there was no sense of liberty, no sense of equality. But that will all begin to change, and that beginning will take place on a battlefield just outside of the village of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Before we move to that battlefield site, let's paint some pictures, mental pictures of this extraordinary man, Abraham Lincoln. Within the English-speaking world, more has been written about Abraham Lincoln than any other single individual, save only Jesus Christ and William Shakespeare. In all the polls amongst scholars, we don't care about polls, man on the street type poll. Amongst scholars, historians, as to the ranking of our presidents, they go back, as best I can tell, to James Schlesinger, noted historian, shortly after World War II, 1946, 47. In about a half dozen, a little more of these polls, Abraham Lincoln is always ranked by these historians as either first or second. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. FDR is always number 3 in these polls. The great commoner, as he was known because of his humble in the state of Kentucky, 1809, into grinding poverty. Father Thomas, he could sign his name, but today we would describe him as functionally illiterate. His mother signed her name with an X. Abraham Lincoln is famous for the fact that he had no formal education. But he grew to a prodigious height. He towered above everyone else. And in fact, he stood 6'4" and is the tallest of all the presidents that we've had, along with LBJ, who also stood 6'4". But Abraham Lincoln, his arms were too long for his body. He shuffled when he walked. He stooped. He was, dare we say, gangly, ungainly, unattractive. I said he was famous for the fact that he had no formal education. In fact, he was highly educated, self-educated. He had a towering intellect, insatiable curiosity. He was a voracious reader. Through his own study, he became steeped in the classics, history, jurisprudence, philosophy, the Bible. His favorite authors included Shakespeare, Byron, Burns, Milton, Euclid, the father of geometry, the most symmetrical, the most logical of all the mathematical disciplines. He studied Euclid and geometry. He wanted to get a better understanding of how you make a presentation that's logical in your writings or in your speech. The more logical he believed, the more persuasive his positions on a policy, on any issue would be. He was raised as a Baptist. As an adult, he's not known to have attended church. He certainly didn't affiliate with a particular denomination. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, tells us that he did believe in the divinity of Christ. His longtime law partner, William Henry Herndon, tells us he did not, but he certainly believed in an omnipotent God. God has wrought this war upon us in retribution for slavery against the North because it condoned it, against the South because it promoted it. As mentioned, he became a lawyer, a great lawyer. Financial, yes, great success financially. And amongst his peers, he was superior. His law partner, Mr. Herndon, I mentioned, tells us that Mr. Lincoln governed all by the superiority of his intellect. His powers of reasoning were unsurpassed. And Lincoln had a sparkling sense of humor. He loved to tell stories. He loved to tell jokes. For example, after a day in the courthouse, the lawyers would gather around, particularly the younger ones. Mr. Lincoln, tell us a story. Well, okay, boys. One time, a man came up to me and stuck a pistol in my face and told me that he had taken an oath to God that if he ever found someone uglier than he was, he'd shoot him. Mr. Lincoln, what'd you say? What'd you do? I told that man to shoot. shoot me dead, because if I'm uglier than you, I don't want to live. The Lincoln-Douglas debates certainly sounds familiar to us, also are reflective of both his substance and his sense of humor. In 1858, this is 2 years before the presidency, this 49-year-old lawyer, Illinois, decides he's going to run for the U.S. Senate. So he pits himself against the great Stephen A. Douglas, the great debater, Stephen A. Douglas, and challenges, young Lincoln challenges this incumbent senator to a series of 7 debates. Douglas accepts. Biggest mistake Douglas ever made. I'll put this young upstart, what's his name? Lincoln. I'll put him in his place. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are in our history books because these are what catapulted Lincoln into the national spotlight. Why? Because of his policies, his views, the logic of his policies and views, the logic. They captured the debates captured the attention of the fledgling Republican Party, which 2 years later nominated him for the presidency. And of course, we know he was elected. In this debate, we were talking about sense of humor. Senator Douglas is there. He accuses Mr. Lincoln of A, B, and C, and then concludes by saying, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Lincoln, he is two-faced. It's Lincoln's turn to respond. He responds A, B, and C and says, ladies and gentlemen, with respect to the eminent senator's accusation that I am two-faced, I say to you, you be the judge. If I am two-faced, would I choose this one? His sense of humor surely served him well as Mrs. Lincoln during the 4 stress-filled years of the Civil War. They lost their 11-year-old beloved son, Willie, to typhoid fever. God has taken our beloved Willie from us to help me better understand the grief that the poor widows feel from this awful war. Mrs. Lincoln lost 2 brothers in battle in the war, both of whom were fighting for the Confederacy. Quick bullet points with respect to what we might describe, Lincoln's philosophy. Deeply held beliefs as they relate to the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln abhorred slavery. 1864, this is toward the end of the war, he writes this: I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. Think of the logic, the persuasiveness of his second sentence. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Lincoln was devoted to democracy. The sovereign is you and me. We, the people, are the sovereign. There is no king. That's what a democracy is all about. We decide who our leaders will be. It's not a birthright. He was devoted to democracy. He believed that democracy and the enslavement of our fellow men and women mutually exclusive. You can't have a democracy and allow slavery over the long term. In 1858, this is 2 years before the presidency, he delivers what's in our history books as Lincoln's House Divided speech. Lincoln tells us this, drawing from the Gospels of Mark and Matthew: a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe that a government half free and half slave cannot long endure. I do not believe this union will dissolve. I do not believe this house will fall. I do believe it will cease to be divided. It will become all of one or the other. Also in that same year, 2 years before the presidency, he gives us a succinct definition of a democracy, and at the same time, he's looking that slave master right in the eye, exposing the slave master's hypocrisy. Lincoln tells us this 2 years before the presidency: as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of a democracy. If there is a difference, it is no democracy. He's telling that slave master, if you be a slave master, your great-great-grandson can be enslaved. If your great-great-grandson can be enslaved, your great-great-great-great-granddaughter can be enslaved. If one person, Lincoln believed, can be enslaved because of his race, then in time, a woman can be enslaved because of her religion. Think the Jewish Holocaust, Hitler. And if a woman can be enslaved because of her religion, then on down the line, the great-great-great-great-granddaughter can be enslaved for speaking out against the government, engaging in hate speech. If one person can be enslaved, everyone can be enslaved, and no one is truly free. And if we are not free, we are not a democracy. We are ruled by a tyrant, a despot, some sort of totalitarian, authoritarian type of government. Lincoln had a conciliatory nature about him. Very endearing, very humble man. An example reflective of his conciliatory nature, perhaps my favorite of all his writings, is in his second inaugural address. As his second election, his re-election is forthcoming. It's clear that the North is going to prevail in the war. He's re-elected, and at the time, Lincoln is looking toward the terms of the surrender. He's devoid of hubris, no sense of revenge, no vendetta. He wants to welcome the South back into the fold. Pause. How many of us have been to the Lincoln Memorial on the Mall in DC? If we're seated on the great man's lap, off to the left is his second inaugural address. Off to the right is the Gettysburg Address. It's the last paragraph in his second inaugural that I'm leading up to reveal his welcoming heart. Come back into the Union. 11 states that seceded, the 4 slave states that never did secede. Welcome back. His last paragraph: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Poetic prose. Go back with me, if you will. The year is 1863. Right here where we're seated, we're on a battlefield just outside the village of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The war has been blazing for 2 long years. We, the North, the Union, has been outgeneraled battle after battle after battle. Generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson seemed superior to our Union generals. We have no reason to believe we, the Union, the North, can prevail. We have a hope, just no reason to think that we really can. And right here where we're seated, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, a mighty battle, a 3-day battle took place, the Battle of Gettysburg. On the 4th day, July 4th, think of that day, rather propitious. On the 4th day, General Lee and his Confederate soldiers limped back to Virginia. It was a victory for the North, not what you could describe as a resounding victory, but a victory nonetheless. And we needed the victory. On that same day, July 4th, halfway across the continent on the Mississippi River, Vicksburg, Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant prevails in the siege of Vicksburg. 2 victories, July 4th. What did many of us believe? This was a sign of providence, that providence was on our side. We didn't know it now. And a year from now, we'll look back to this day, July 4th, 1863. This was the turning point in the war. Right here on Gettysburg battlefield, we lost between 50 and 55,000 casualties of this war. This would turn out to be the bloodiest, costliest battle in the entire war. 50,000 boys. July 4th, 18. August, the governor of Pennsylvania is getting letter complaints from locals saying there's something wrong, there's a stench, this needs to be cleaned up, this battlefield does. The governor sends his private secretary out to examine the site, and he's out there looking around, and to his disbelief, there were hundreds unburied bodies, half buried, strewn across this entire battlefield. Feral hogs were feasting. Secretary reports back to the governor. Governor was horrified. We must establish this site as a national cemetery to honor those boys in blue, the Union boys that sacrificed all for this cause. Yes, a national cemetery. Send word out to the other governors in the North, see if they agree. Yes, we agree, we agree. Yes, we're going to have this site right here established as a national cemetery to honor the boys in blue who sacrificed all. Move forward to September. You know, if we're going to create really a national cemetery, one of note, we have to have a ceremony. We have to have a dedication ceremony. And back in those days, all dedication ceremonies featured an oration. We need an orator. Who is it that can give the oration that this battlefield deserves? Well, there's only one orator worthy of this grand occasion, the greatest orator of the age, Edward Everett. Yes, Edward Everett. He taught classics at Harvard, and then he became president of Harvard, governor of Massachusetts, U.S. senator from Massachusetts, U.S. senator to England, U.S. Secretary of State, Edward Everett, the greatest orator of the age. Invitation goes out. Senator Everett reads it. Oh, I would be honored to deliver the oration, but you have it scheduled for October. That's only 1 month away. I need at least 2 months. Okay, November 19th, 1863, it's set. The event planners, this will be a grand success. The great Edward Everett will give the oration. It's now October, 1 month away. You know, we need a formal dedication of this site. Yes, a formal day. Who could make the formal education? Well, the president's house, Mr. Lincoln, that's a short train ride away. Well, I don't know. The president, he likes to tell jokes. He likes to tell stories. This needs to be a formal, highly respectful ceremony. Well, I'll issue the invitation accordingly. He'll know to keep it formal. Then we're now in the president's house. We didn't call it the White House back then. The moniker of the White House didn't come about till Theodore Roosevelt, the early 1900s. We can almost see the president going through his mail. Mrs. Lincoln, I've been asked to deliver the dedication of the new National Cemetery outside of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Where's that? Where's that? Well, look, Mrs. Lincoln, they have asked me to make, let's see, a few appropriate remarks. I accept. It's now November 19th. Those of us in this room were actually seated out there on the site. The dais is right in front of us. We know that the ceremony is going to begin at 3 o'clock. We're excited. We're talking amongst each other and looking at a program. The program says ceremony begins at 3 o'clock. Music, opening prayer, oration, the Honorable Edward Everett, more music, dedication, the President of the United States. Wasn't that interesting? His name isn't even on the program, but there, that's President Lincoln right over there. He's here. Then a dirge, a funeral rite, and then the benediction and the sermon. And Mr. Norris and I, we're excited. You know, we stand up and look behind us. Mr. Norris says, you know, there must be 15,000 people here. Maybe as many as 20,000 people. And our classics professor at Harvard, he's going to give the oration. Oh, he was the best professor I ever had. About this time, it begins and finishes. Edward Everett walks across the dais, open notebook, reaches the podium, and quite conspicuously closes the notebook and sets it down and begins to orate for 2.5 hours. For 2.5 hours. Being a classics professor, he takes us back to antiquity, the Battle of Marathon, the 30 Years' War, comparing those epical events with what had just happened right here 4.5 months earlier. Senator Everett invokes the great Pericles, the father of democracy, the great Pericles, about 450 BC, leader of the Athenians, Peloponnesian Wars, Athens versus Sparta. Mr. Norris knows them well. And Mr. Norris and I, having had Senator Everett for our professor, Pericles, oh my goodness, we look at each other. Pericles is noted for having delivered the greatest funeral dedication in all of world history. That was Pericles, the greatest funeral dedication until this day. In 1863, Edward Everett resumes his seat. We're all looking at each other in awe. He was inspiring. We had never heard such erudition. The organizers of the event were thrilled. He had given this ceremony the dignity, the reverence, the respect that we had hoped, a success. This will be remembered for years to come. John Hay was Lincoln's personal secretary. John Hay writes this: Senator Everett kept us all spellbound. We were in rapt attention of everything that he said. It's about that time President Lincoln reaches the podium. 2.5 minutes, 10 sentences, 272 words. He changes the course of history. He introduces to the people here in the audience, the people of the United States and to the world, The fact will prove that our nation was founded on liberty and equality. 80 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He says a new nation. He doesn't mean new in the sense of a new house, a new automobile. He means new in the sense that never in all of world history had a nation been founded on principles of a high level. Previously, all nations were founded as a result of conquest of war, maybe religion, ethnicity, race, family, or geography. Our nation, the United States, was founded on principles. Lincoln tells us those principles are liberty and equality. And he proves it by taking us back 87 years to the year 1776. And many of us in the audience knew immediately what he was talking about, where he was drawing his proof. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. It isn't what Jefferson meant, but Lincoln is telling, this is what it means now. Liberty, equality for everyone. And in his second sentence, Lincoln explains to the broken-hearted widows, the grieving mother and dad, and the bewildered orphans why their husband, son, father was killed in this war. As Lincoln says, we are now engaged in a great civil war, testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and dedicated can long endure. One sentence. They're fighting for principles. They're fighting for the survival of democracy. There was no democracy anywhere else in the world save only the United States. And if we don't have equality and liberty, the United States is going to lose democracy. We're fighting to save democracy. The next 5 sentences, we might refer to them as language of formal dedication. And his prose is such that it's as if he has elevated all of us into the heavens. And we're looking down on this battle site. There are 50,000 boys down there. But Lincoln never refers to the North or the South. There are no proper nouns. There's no union. There's no confederacy. There's no good, bad, righteous, sinful, blue, gray. All 50,000 of those boys are equal. They all sacrificed. The plan, the governor's plan, and Edward Everett as well, they talked in terms of the boys in blue that had sacrificed. Not Lincoln. They're all equal. Then Lincoln closes in one sentence with several phrases. Lincoln is going to tell us that we must persevere in this cause. And what is this cause? He doesn't speak in terms of victory over the South. He says the cause is a new birth of freedom. What's he mean by that? Equality and liberty. And if we don't have this new birth of freedom, democracy will perish, not just here in the United States, but across the world, because we are the only true democracy at this point in time. Every nation, every other nation on earth, king, a queen, a chieftain, oligarchs, military men, and the like. He closes thusly, it is for us, the living, to remain dedicated to the cause before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion, cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here resolve, that these dead shall not have died in vain. And here we go. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Mr. Norris and I are looking at each other. We're eager to read this tomorrow or the next day in the newspapers. This was profound. The reviews in the newspaper were mixed. Interpretations, misinterpretations. I'm not sure any of the initial reviews really interpreted it correctly, but it's difficult. We're still studying it today. We're not necessarily all in agreement as to what Lincoln really meant. Edward Everett immediately recognized its profundity. He writes a letter the next day to the president, congratulating him on the speech, and he asked for a copy of the speech. And then, I would flatter myself to think that in 2.5 hours, I touched upon the essence of this occasion as you did in 2 minutes. Edward Everett realized what had transpired. The war will roar on for another 1.5 years. In the end, this war will take from us what we learned in high school to be 620,000 boys. More recent studies tell us that the deaths are somewhere between 750 and 850,000 boys. And I use the term boys intentionally. Most between the ages of 14 and 30, cut down right at the peak of their productivity, the peak of their reproductivity. In today's population, that would be the equivalent of 8 million boys gone. To repeat what 2 Pulitzer Prize winning historians tell us, Joseph Ellis, one of my favorite historians, tells us that Abraham Lincoln captured, the verb captured, equality and liberty and made them part of the spirit of the United States. He captured equality and liberty and made them integral to our nationhood. Jerry Wills refers to the spirit of America. Lincoln, because of the Gettysburg Address, made equality part of the spirit of America. Within 8 months of the end of the war, which was in a figurative sense, occurred April 9th, 1865. Within 8 months of the end of the war, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution would be ratified, abolishing slavery. Liberty, slavery is abolished, liberty. Then in 2 more years, the 14th Amendment would be ratified, equal protection under the law, equal, the equality that Lincoln sought. The word equal or equality, nowhere else in our Constitution. The 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, as espoused by Lincoln just 2 years, no, that'd be 3.5 years earlier. Then the 15th Amendment, 5 years after the end of the war, voting rights. Those formerly enslaved were guaranteed access to the most hallowed of all halls in a democracy, the one that leads to the ballot box. Liberty, equality, and voting rights, all within 5 years of the end of the war. Abraham Lincoln brought those to the forefront, marking the second founding of our nation. 1 week after the surrender by Robert E. Lee to General Ulysses S. Grant outside the courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia, April 9th, 1865. 1 week later, Abraham Lincoln would be felled by an assassin's bullet. The name of the evildoer, unworthy of our lips. Lincoln is now on his deathbed. He is surrounded by friends and advisors, including his Secretary of War, today we'd say Secretary of Defense, Edwin Stanton. And then when Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, the great commoner, the great emancipator, one of the greatest persons ever to walk the earth, breathed his last, it would be Secretary Stanton that would proclaim, and now he belongs to the ages. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Wow, thank you, Mr. Musser. We appreciate you being here today. Appreciate you sharing.